We are joined by venerable commentator John Rawling, veteran of how many thousand fights, John?
It's a few.
Do many of them match up to what we're set to experience this weekend at the O2, Dubois, Gorman?
Well, not as many as you'd want, certainly. I think what makes this so good, in my opinion, is that I can stand here now and say, come Saturday night, I honestly don't know. You know, you can make out a persuasive argument for either man.
No one's confidently calling it, are they?
No, and I think the bookies have got Daniel as the favourite, but there are plenty of people whose opinion I respect who are leaning towards Nathan for the movement and the boxing skills. It's a fascinating fight, and two undefeated prospects at this stage of their career laying it on the line. I think you probably have to go back to another weight division, and for James DeGale and George Groves, for people who were of similar stature with potentially so much to lose.
Going back through the years on the British heavyweight scene, what parallels can you draw from other fights you might have covered?
Well, I remember back in the 90s with Lennox Lewis and Gary Mason. That's the one which probably springs to mind most, and both were undefeated at that stage. If memory serves me right, I think Gary was the British champion and Lennox was the European champion. And it's you know, people perhaps who weren't there find it hard to imagine, but at the time there were lots of people who thought that Gary Mason was going to be too big and too rugged for Lennox Lewis, and that Lennox was the boxer, and despite his amateur pedigree, that he'd get found out when it came to. Now, of course, history tells us that when it came to, Gary was incredibly game, gave it a great shot, but Lennox was just technically too good for him, and I think on the night just a little bit too big for him as well. It was a tremendous fight, and I think that's kind of the one which I think is the closest parallel.
If I recall, didn't Gary start very strongly in that fight?
Yeah, he did, absolutely. He started like the man who believed he was going to win, as I say, as plenty of people did, and he had that bull-like strength, Gary Mason, and he was a far better fighter than he was given credit for. You know, he was a little bit in the shadow of Frank Bruno, but Gary Mason was a very good fighter, and had he been around today, he'd have made himself an awful lot of money.
Well, if you think about it, I mean, back then and around the time of Frank Bruno, Gary Mason, you also had Horace Notice, Henry Akin one day, I'm missing one, Funso Banjo. It's very similar to what we've got today, but the difference is now we've got two of ours fighting each other. That lot didn't fight each other. No,
they were very, very well protected, weren't they? It was a different management ethos in those days. Most of them were connected with Mickey Duff, Jarvis Astaire, Terry Lawless, and it was not their way to put their men in against each other and get them knocked off. Frank Warren has a different way of looking at it, which I think is refreshing. He's saying, yeah, I've got two tremendous prospects, as he has in these two, but if they lose, it's not the end of the world. They can come again.
Do you see any way this fight can fail? I mean, I know we all hope it doesn't, but do you see, is there a percentage that says this could be a grab and spoil at all, and it might not be quite what we're expecting?
Well, you never know. You know, sometimes I've expected tremendous fights.
Sometimes we expect too much, don't we?
Yeah, you know, you expect everything to be an absolute barn burner, and it's not, and it doesn't always work out that way. I mean, this isn't going to be a toe-to-toe slugging match, I don't think. I don't see that, because that wouldn't be in Nathan's interest to do that. He's the cuter mover. I think he's a slicker boxer. But you know, I mean, Daniel's got boxing skills as well. You really don't know. That's the great imponderable, isn't it? I think it's fascinating. I can't wait. I think it's going to be. I personally think it will be a good fight, but spoiling, I don't think it'll be too bad.
We shouldn't overlook the fact that Joe and Brian Jennings could steal the show.
Well, there are people who are saying that in international terms. That probably means a wee bit more. You know, for instance, on the other side of the pond. Yeah, Brian Jennings said that, and I think he's right. You know, he's been around for a long time. He's fought for a world title. He's fought in good company, and to an extent, for Joe Joyce, it's kind of a coming of age fight, isn't it? Mm. It's a notch up from from Ustinov and Stiverne. You know, if he comes through this and looks good, then that's going to be a big feather in his cap and a great name on his record, which if he's moving towards a potential world title fight against Marius Vac, for instance, for the WBA regular title, to have a win against somebody of the standard of Bryant Jennings would be a very good thing to have. Jennings, from his perspective, sees it as a way right back up to the elite.
Last question, a little bit random. What takes your fancy from the undercard? Dennis the Menace, McCann, Mark Chamberlain? Who's the one you're actually thinking of getting in early to have a look at?
Cool. That's a difficult one. I thought McCann on his debut looked sensational. You know,
an introduction, wasn't it?
There was more. It was sort of the time warp thing, and I spoke to Frank afterwards, and he sort of said, "I know what you're going to say, Naz." Yeah. There was more than a little bit of Nazim Hamid about him, and first view, so you don't want to burden him with too much expectation, but McCann looked a little bit special.